Let me tell you something about genius that the mythology gets completely wrong. The lone visionary, the person who arrives fully formed with a mind that operates on a different plane from everyone around them, the natural gift so extraordinary that the rules of ordinary development simply do not apply. The IQ so stratospheric that conventional understanding of human cognition cannot contain it. That story is compelling. It is also, the psychology research finds, almost entirely misleading. Not because genius is not real, not because the extraordinary cognitive achievements of the people history labels as geniuses were not extraordinary, but because the mythology of innate, effortless, categorically different intelligence obscures what the research actually finds about how exceptional cognitive achievement develops, what conditions produce it, what psychological characteristics it requires, and what it costs the people who carry it. The psychology of genius is one of the most fascinating and most misrepresented areas in the entire cognitive science literature, and understanding it honestly, without the mythology, without the romanticization, without the comfortable story that exceptional minds are simply born rather than built, changes everything about how we understand human potential. That is what we are examining today. Let's start with the foundational question. What is genius actually measuring? The popular understanding conflates genius with IQ, with the raw cognitive processing power that intelligence tests are designed to capture, and IQ is real. It is one of the most robust and most replicable measurements in all of psychology. It predicts academic performance, professional achievement, and a range of life outcomes with a consistency that makes it impossible to dismiss. But the research on the relationship between IQ and exceptional creative or intellectual achievement, the kind of achievement that history labels as genius, produces a finding that consistently surprises people. Beyond a certain threshold, IQ does not predict exceptional achievement. Dean Keith Simonton's landmark research on the psychology of genius, conducted across decades and involving the systematic analysis of hundreds of individuals whose contributions history has identified as exceptional, found a threshold effect. Below approximately IQ 120, higher cognitive ability consistently predicts better outcomes. But above that threshold, the relationship between IQ and exceptional achievement becomes increasingly weak. This is sometimes called the threshold hypothesis, and its implication is significant. The person with an IQ of 180 is not reliably more likely to produce genius-level work than the person with an IQ of 130. Other variables: personality, motivation, creative thinking style, domain knowledge, the specific environmental conditions that allow exceptional cognition to develop and express, become more predictive than raw cognitive horsepower once the basic threshold of sufficient intelligence has been crossed. Genius, the research suggests, is not primarily a story about IQ. Here is the finding that I think is most important and most consistently ignored in the public conversation about exceptional minds. Anders Ericsson's research on expert performance, the foundational work on deliberate practice that we discussed in the skill acquisition script, applies directly to the question of genius, and what it finds directly challenges the innate gift narrative. Ericsson's research on individuals who achieved exceptional levels of performance across multiple domains, from chess to music to mathematics to sport, consistently found that what distinguished the exceptional performer from the merely excellent was not the presence of an innate gift that others lacked. It was the specific quality and quantity of engagement with the domain across extended time. Deliberate practice, the specific, effortful, feedback-guided practice at the edge of current capability that we discussed in detail previously, applied across 10 years minimum, what Ericsson identified as the 10-year rule in virtually every domain of exceptional achievement the research examined. This finding is not comfortable for the genius mythology because it implies that exceptional cognitive achievement is not categorically different from other forms of achievement, that the same mechanisms, sustained deliberate engagement, deep domain knowledge, the continuous pushing of capability beyond its current limits, that produce expertise in any domain are the mechanisms through which genius-level achievement develops. The genius is not someone who bypassed the developmental process. They are someone who engaged it more deeply, more deliberately, and across more sustained time than anyone around them. Here is the personality research, because the cognitive picture alone is incomplete without it. Simonton's research on the personality characteristics of historically identified geniuses, and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's interviews with nearly 100 individuals identified as exceptional creative contributors across multiple domains, identified a consistent constellation of personality characteristics that the research finds more predictive of exceptional achievement than IQ. Openness to experience. Consistently, the personality trait most strongly associated with creative achievement across every domain the research has examined. The willingness to engage with novel ideas, unconventional perspectives, and the unfamiliar. The specific absence of the cognitive closure that most people bring to genuinely new information. The research on openness and cognitive flexibility, and the specific relationship between openness and the default mode network activity we have discussed extensively, finds that high openness individuals show more fluid connection between associative and analytical thinking, more spontaneous generation of unusual connections between apparently unrelated concepts, more willingness to follow an idea into territory where the outcome is uncertain. Intrinsic motivation. The research on creative genius consistently finds that the individuals who produce exceptional work are almost uniformly driven by intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation, by genuine fascination with the domain itself rather than by external reward or recognition. Csikszentmihalyi's interviews found that the creative individuals most consistently described entering states of flow, the complete absorption in the work itself that we have discussed in previous scripts. During their most productive periods, the work was its own reward in the most literal psychological sense. Tolerance for ambiguity. The capacity to hold unresolved questions without the urgent need for closure that most people experience as uncomfortable. To live inside a problem for months or years without forcing premature resolution. This tolerance is one of the most consistent findings in the psychology of exceptional creative achievement and one of the least discussed. Let me talk about the neuroscience, because the brain of the exceptionally creative individual shows specific and measurable differences that the research has been documenting with increasing precision. Rex Jung and Richard Hayer's research on the neuroscience of intelligence and creativity, including the development of what they called the parieto-frontal integration theory, found that raw intelligence is associated with more efficient neural processing, more signal with less neural noise, faster and more accurate transmission of information through the networks that analytical thinking relies on. But creativity, and specifically the kind of creative thinking associated with exceptional original contribution, showed a different neural signature. Not more efficient processing in the analytical networks, more spontaneous and more fluid connection between the default mode network and the executive control network. The same finding we discussed in the creativity script, but at a level of development and integration that the research finds in exceptional creative individuals to a degree that more ordinary creative thinkers do not match. The genius brain is not simply a faster analytical machine. It is a brain in which the resting state imaginative network and the focused analytical network are unusually well connected and unusually able to operate in creative concert, to simultaneously generate novel associations and evaluate their quality and relevance. This neural architecture is partly constitutional, but the research on neuroplasticity and deliberate practice and the specific ways that sustained domain engagement reshapes the neural architecture over time suggests it is also partly built. The brain that has engaged a domain with the depth and the duration that exceptional achievement requires has literally been reshaped by that engagement in ways that the casual observer cannot see. Here is the environmental research, because no account of genius is complete without it. The mythology of genius treats exceptional cognitive achievement as something that emerges from the individual independent of context. The lone visionary whose mind would have produced what it produced regardless of circumstance. The historical and psychological research on the conditions that have produced clusters of exceptional achievement. The specific times and places that generated unusual concentrations of genius-level contribution tells a completely different story. Athens in the 5th century BC, Florence during the Renaissance, Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, the Bell Labs research environment in the mid-20th century, Silicon Valley in the late 20th century, In each case, the research finds not a random distribution of individually exceptional minds producing independently, but a specific environmental configuration of intellectual density, of cross-domain exchange, of productive competition, of institutional support for genuine risk-taking that produced achievement that none of the individuals involved would have produced in isolation. Csikszentmihalyi's systems model of creativity, which frames creative achievement as the product of the interaction between an individual, a domain, and a field, is directly relevant. The genius is not just a person with an exceptional mind. They are an exceptional mind in productive relationship with a domain rich enough to reward their engagement and a field open enough to recognize and build on their contribution. Remove any of those three elements, and the exceptional achievement does not happen in the same form. Let me talk about the psychological costs. Because the honest picture requires it and the mythology consistently obscures it, the research on the psychological well-being of exceptionally gifted individuals, and the clinical literature on what the developmental psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski called the overexcitabilities associated with exceptional giftedness, documents a constellation of experiences that the genius narrative romanticizes, and the people living them find genuinely difficult. The same openness to experience that produces exceptional creative sensitivity produces exceptional sensitivity to everything, to beauty and to suffering in equal measure, to the complexity and the tragedy of the human condition at a depth that most people's psychological armor protects them from reaching. The same capacity for sustained absorption in problems that produces exceptional intellectual achievement produces a specific difficulty with the ordinary, with the mundane demands of daily life that the mind calibrated for depth finds genuinely difficult to engage with at the level they require. Dabrowski's research on what he called positive disintegration, the process by which the exceptionally gifted individual's psychology undergoes repeated periods of crisis and reconstruction in the process of development, is one of the most important and least discussed contributions to the psychology of exceptional minds. The genius does not arrive at their exceptional functioning through smooth, untroubled development. They arrive through a process of repeated psychological challenge that most people of ordinary gifts never encounter. The research on mood disorders and exceptional creative achievement, the work of K. Redfield Jamison and the subsequent literature we discussed in the creativity script, is relevant here. The elevated rates of depression, of bipolar disorder, of the specific psychological presentations associated with heightened sensitivity and depth of processing are not incidental features of genius. They are connected, the research suggests, to the same neurological and psychological configuration that produces the exceptional creative capacity. Here is the finding that ties everything together, and the one that I think is most important for anyone who encounters this topic. Genius is not a fixed state. It is not something you have or do not have. Simonton's research on creative productivity across the lifespan found something that the static genius mythology cannot accommodate. Exceptional creative output is not produced uniformly across a life. It clusters. It has periods of extraordinary productivity and periods of relative quiet. It responds to conditions of inspiration, of challenge, of the specific productive friction of working at the edge of the known in ways that are dynamic rather than fixed. And the research on what produces those peak periods of exceptional output is consistent with everything we have discussed. Deep domain knowledge combined with openness to genuinely new problems. Intrinsic motivation operating in conditions that support sustained autonomous engagement. The specific neural architecture of connected associative and analytical thinking operating on problems rich enough to reward it. These are conditions, not fixed properties of a special category of person. The genius is not someone who is exempt from the developmental process. They are someone in whom the developmental process produced, through the specific combination of temperament, environment, deliberate engagement, and the sustained confrontation with problems worthy of their capacity. The specific psychological and neurological configuration that exceptional achievement requires. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of genius is not a story about a category of human being fundamentally different from the rest. It is a story about the specific conditions, internal and external, psychological and neurological, developmental and environmental, that allow human cognitive potential to express itself at the furthest edge of what is possible. The threshold of sufficient intelligence, the personality characteristics, openness, intrinsic motivation, tolerance for ambiguity, that produce the willingness to engage a domain at the depth exceptional achievement requires. The deliberate practice across extended time that builds the domain knowledge and the neural architecture that exceptional contribution demands. The environmental conditions that support, challenge, and receive exceptional work. And the psychological costs, the sensitivity, the difficulty with the ordinary, the specific challenges of a mind calibrated for depth in a world calibrated for average that the same configuration produces. Understanding all of that does not make genius ordinary. The achievements of the individual's history labels as geniuses are genuinely extraordinary. The contributions they made are genuinely irreplaceable, but understanding it does make genius human, does place exceptional cognitive achievement within the framework of what the research knows about how human potential develops, does suggest that the conditions that produce it, while not universally available, are not as categorically different from the conditions that produce ordinary excellence as the mythology suggests. The genius is not a different kind of person. They are a person in whom the process of becoming went further, under conditions that allowed it to.